a couple of comments afterwards. It stems from work that we've done on carbon mapping for fruit fruit exports from South Africa to mostly Europe and UK. And I think the interesting part here is it touches very much on the previous discussions we just had in terms of trying to accurately allocate emissions to a shipment of fruit. I think there we struggle again in terms of different data sets, different allocation methods. So this is a little of my agenda. I'll quickly just talk one or two slides. I think the audience here understand the importance and in terms of emissions of road transport, talk about the calculation, how we've done it. And I think in a sense, this presentation is a reflection on the emissions the emission factors that's available that we're supposed to use. And then the accuracy of that and what is our action plan from South Africa's perspective. So road freight transport, as all of you know, it's a key aspect of any business. In terms of what we have in South Africa, it's at this stage over 90% of our total freight complement. It's extensive in the importance of making sure that goods stay on the table and on the shelves. Similarly, in other countries, lots of time kilometers, and most of it in South Africa, there's one or two electric trucks, there's one or two other alternative vehicles in terms of gas, in terms of LPG or even LNG. But it's more sporadic trials at this stage. In terms of the emissions side, globally, it's a very large portion of that, and I think we've seen on the slide about that, so I'll just skip ahead. I think the big thing for us when we looked at this, trying to figure out where does freight emissions actually, how does it fit in terms of road freight? So there's the fuel-based and activity-based approach. We reviewed these two options. The one challenge that we experienced, and this is the comments that I wanted to make, was the challenge of complexity versus simplicity. Because on the one side, we wanted it as simple as possible for people to calculate, but you need it to be accurate, especially if we get a situation where you get carbon border adjustment mechanisms being implemented, and now suddenly you have this challenge that you're going to tax people for imported or exported goods based on their scope 3 emissions. So how do you make sure that's accurate if you want to, let's say, carbon tax a farmer that exports agricultural produce to your country? How do you allocate it fairly and accurately to be able to do those carbon adjustments? Because that not only has carbon environmental impacts, it has then a financial impact that leads to a social impact in terms of job creation in a country where there's a lot of or quite high unemployment rate. So complexity of data, needing actual data and having it available, as the gentleman over here stated earlier, that a lot of people just don't use it and not prepared to share it. So not having that data. So we're left with the only opportunity then is to use activity-based approaches. And what we find then is there's this emission intensity factor. And if you don't have a perfect emission intensity factor, it means you again on a wrong answer or ending on a wrong answer for this. So how do we get an accurate factor? What we did refer back to the ISO standards, the GLEC framework, and basically use those values as starting points, but realized soon that how accurate are these? So if you look at this, this is something that we just look up. So in terms of these red countries, so that's basically what's included in the neglect framework, very specific values, and then what's cited for the ones included is if you actually want to use these, this is what we're going to do. So for the red regions, plus 22%, that's ambient, and for refrigerated coal, you add an additional 18%. So that's essentially what we have to use based on that. So if we look at that into part of this fruit export study that we've done over the last 3 years, what we saw there is large data sets that we went to the point of looking at delivery documentation to get accurate weights of specific consignments. We looked at the field records, matched them one-to-one to actually get a real. So we took the first approach. So if we go back, so essentially we took this approach on a reasonable data set to try and actually get real emission factors. And once we started to do that, and here's some of the vehicle examples. This was specific then for fruit export. So some of these vehicle configurations on the left here typically farm to back out or back out to cold store, and then moving down to port deliveries for those fruit exports. So look at the collected data for these vehicles, calculated the emission factors, so went through the whole exercise and came up with comparing that to the neglect framework for South African circumstances. What we end up in the two figures we should have highlighted now is this. So on dry ambient, the neglect overstates our emissions by 30%, and on the refrigerated, it overstates it by 38%, 39%. So the challenge here is if we're going to do, let me go back to why did we do this? For the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, if we're going to be taxed based on these numbers, then that's not fair. So how do we get accurate numbers to make sure that that whatever happens in that space is fair? I think in terms of this, just 1 or 2 points is obviously these what we had in discussions with the small franchisee about the neglect framework is that it's based on, let's call it the average truck in Africa. Now, the trucks that are used to export fruit is not the average truck in Africa. Most of these are Euro 5 or Euro 6 trucks, as you know them here. The configuration in terms of vehicle load factors, in terms of the empty running configurations is developed world-class logistics systems. So it ends up being closer to actually European numbers. And that's obviously some of the other freight might have much worse numbers. So it's a question of getting eventually working through a couple of things like commodity goods configuration of vehicles, type of vehicles, type of traders, and use the loading conditions proportionally empty runs. So those are the things that we probably will have to expand and look through a couple of different perspectives to try and understand and actually suggest what is accurate if there is something emission factors for the South African circumstances. So a number of other things to consider in terms of the emission intensity factor is the time and the age of assets. So to what extent not only the vehicle, but the refrigeration unit, the trailers, things like the wheel lines, all those things that plays into typical operating conditions. The transport infrastructure, I'm busy with the project now about exports. If you're interested in hearing stories about corridors, habitat reality, customs, regulatory compliance, complexities with that, geography and landscapes, the things in terms of some of the corridors in South Africa related to this has very high inclines, extensive altitude going over the extent of the corridor as well as the impact on us. And then there's the workforce side, things like maintenance, etc. So when we say original emission factors which needed, our action plan, what we're busy with is working with a small private center to say, should we do the proposal together and actually develop development transport. In this sense, we could probably extend it beyond just South Africa. Most of our operators also operate into Southern Africa. And potentially also with some connections that we're working with into Eastern Africa. So look at fuel consumption values is to establish emission intensity factors and then for different configurations of vehicles. So that's the action plan for us is to based on this go into much more depth and maybe somewhere in the near or not hopefully not too far future, there might be an addendum to the latest play stating these emission factors for Southern Africa. Okay, a couple of references, and if you ever want to visit Stellenbosch, there's a beautiful picture of our center of campus. Thank you.
Questions for Eeden?
Just your dealings with the SFC, I think it was very justified initially. What would feedback be? I mean, what's their incentive to kind of develop these very specific factors for South Africa and Africa? Are you getting a positive feedback? What's the sense?
Can you repeat the questions? Yeah, I'll repeat the questions. So it's about what is the feedback about from corporates relating to developing something like this. So at this stage, that we're open for it. What we have to eventually do is get funding for it. So the question is whether we can collectively actually set up a funding model that can work, that somebody will need to fund us to actually go through the process and develop that. So anybody's willing to support, we are open for business.
We have another question right there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you've done a supply chain complex calculation on fruit distribution. So you've got that good data, you've done a complex bit, and you're comparing it to something from the Glen, which is a default. And one of the ideas around default values anyway is to try and get a higher value, so you're not advantaged by doing less detail. So you've just found out that fruit side, you've got more accurate, more precise measure whether it's needed or not. That's good. So there's a question.
Thanks. Should I repeat that as well?
Yeah, maybe nice insight. Of course.
I think, yeah, so the comment is the data framework is actually approached as something that's a higher, not, it's an estimate that will give somebody something to use. To some extent, it might be put to a higher side for the pure reason that you want to encourage people to reduce emissions. But I think also we've gone very specific, and I agree with that on this is exactly for one segment, very narrow and deep and accurate, and you will find probably that that will be lower or different minimally.
In that way, it incentivizes using real data, right? Because
yes.
If you don't, then you're bad luck because your emissions will be higher.
You also get better reduction percentages if you go online.
Yeah.
It works both ways.
Okay.
Calculating by some of the behavior, and then you use your own to get the benefits.
Okay, the road is low.
I think the challenge is that if you're going to be taxed by on that, just the whole industry, then I guess they're gonna flood to us and give us that funding to make sure we do it accurate.
Fernando.
Yeah, at the end, we had a discussion recently with one of the shippers that actually when you look into working with emission factors, it gives a time on empty miles over. That when you look with primary data of a particular assignment, you may get into the risk of losing that additional carbon footprint that is directly created by the shipment, but will never go and be part of that measure. So then we need to ensure when we look at emission factors, the primary data, that we don't focus too much on something, and then we lose other aspects that are also creating emissions out of that particular operation and service. So how you would address that?
So I think maybe just to the comment here was if you look at one commodity that we've done on freight, on fruit exports, you might lose the creative this steady challenge of what we did with this data was to actually look at that integrating and making sure, because what we realized many of the fruit production regions are quite far outlined. So you often have to run empty in that direction and then full back. So we looked at that in terms of those corridors and looked at specific vehicle empty running percentages related to, so the operators that operate there to have an empty running that's not fruit related but realistically. So that's what we did. Okay.
Difficult to get through, but if there are no other questions, then I propose we go to the